My game of the day from round 2 of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament is Magnus Carlsen against Radoslav Wojtaszek, world champion with the white pieces for the first time in the tournament and looking to score a win. He's in their previous encounters, he has scored 2 good victories with the white pieces against the Poles. So this was the day where he wanted to press, certainly. So Wojtaszek played his customary Najdorf variation, and Carlsen played A3, this very, very rare move. It's basically a waiting move, seeing how black commits himself. And this was the move that Carlsen played in the first round against Geary. And Carlsen said he got inspiration from Carlsen. Wojtaszek played the classic Najdorf move, E5. You certainly don't need to play that. You can play E6 or G6. And yesterday, Carlsen played the orthodox Knight F3. But Carlsen had spotted a devilish little idea, typical of the world champion. Very provocative move, Knight F5. Very unusual, actually. Now, if this is taken, then white would like to try and gain control of these light squares. But Wojtaszek reacted, I think, very well with D5, trying to undermine the position of the knight on F5. Obviously, if this is taken, then bishop takes F5, black wins a piece. So Carlsen played bishop G5 after not very much thought. You have to play this with white, really. And if the pawn is taken here, then white gets a tremendous initiative after Castle's queenside check. This is very dangerous for black. So D4 from Wojtaszek, good move. Carlsen exchanged on F6. And now here I think the best move is to recapture with the pawn. I can understand why Wojtaszek didn't wish to damage his pawn structure, but still I think this is the best way to go, because now that knight must retreat. Can't move to D5 because bishop takes knight, undermining the protection of the knight here. So if the knight has to retreat to B1 or E2, then it feels as though black should be fine there. White is losing time. But instead Wojtaszek wanted to keep his structure intact, and he recaptured with the queen, even if it meant that after knight D5 the queen was attacked and had to go back. Because once again there's a threat to play bishop takes knight to win the knight here. At first it seems as though black is doing fine, because for example after a move like C4 to protect this knight, then the knight on F5 can simply be driven back, and I think black is absolutely fine in that position. Dark squared bishop has no opponent. But instead Carlsen came up with this move Queen G4, which really must have been underestimated by Wojtaszek. First of all, there's a threat to take the pawn on G7. Now black would very much like to play G6, which at first sight looks like it's fatal for white because of this pin. But here is Carlsen's clever idea. He wanted to push the queen back to G3. If pawn takes knight, then queen takes check, and then you take the rook. Okay, so what if you protect the pawn? Knight C6, and here is the killer idea. Knight takes D4. What a clever tactic. If knight takes, then queen takes, check, hits the rook, hits the knight. And if pawn takes, then knight C7 with a deadly fork, deadly knight fork. So Wojtaszek had to compromise here. He exchanged off his very nice light squared bishop, and that's exactly what Carlsen wanted. Bishop D6 from Wojtaszek. Now, if black is given time to consolidate, for example, brings this knight into play and manages to exchange off the knight on D5, then he should be doing okay. So Carlsen needs to somehow grab the initiative. Carlsen had his longest think of the game here. He thought for around 17.5 minutes over this excellent move. So instead of thinking about getting his king to safety, he's thinking about charging forward. So sometimes you can push this pawn forward, but the other idea is to bring his rook into play. And here we go, rook to h3. So this rook could come into play along the third rank. So black manages to exchange off that dangerous knight on d5, but it's been replaced by this superb light squared bishop. And you can see the difference between the bishops. The black bishop is rather restricted by its own pawns. The white bishop is the right side of the pawn structure and beams down to this sensitive square on f7. So white is just more active than black here. Bishop attacks the rook. So rook moved, rook g3, threatening a mate on g7. So Wojtaszek has to defend that. And now here is the next very interesting moment where Carlsen invested 9.5 minutes. By his standards, quite a long think. White could just castle queenside here. And perhaps try to bring the rook into play along the third rank. But there is potential later on for black to try and force open a file on the queen side. So what Carlsen did was play a pawn to a4 first to open up that side of the board. Well, hang on, what's going on here? Well, if black closes the position with b4, then I think it would have been his intention to castle in this position, because now the structure on the queen side, the pawn structure, is relatively locked, and that white king is much more secure coming around to this square. Black can't really break open files there, and then white would have a free hand on the king side to attack. So Wojtaszek gave a check. Now that prevents queenside castling, but in this case the king went the other way. The king is actually safe here, but also it means that black is forced to open the queen side. So let's just take stock for a moment. The white king is actually safe here. White has pressure on the king side, but also potentially there is pressure on the queen side as well. So black's problem is, where is his play coming from? In such situations where his opponent has very little counterplay, Carlsen is just supreme. First of all, he tucks his king away to safety, so just stepping out of the way of this open diagonal. Now here's a nice little ploy, a teasing move from Carlsen. So looking at this pawn here, and sometimes rook f3 might come. So that induces this move g6. The queen steps back again, but now white has a little something to nibble on with that pawn. So this is a little bit weaker. Sometimes white can even use the open h file as well. Very nice play. Queen comes to f4, so Wojtaszek is desperate to relieve the pressure by exchanging queens, but no way. Queen comes back. Hitting the rook, the queen comes back to defend, and now Carlsen switches sides of the board with the queen. So he's looking at the weak pawn here, he's looking at the pawn here. He's still got his eye on the rook. You never know, this queen might lunge down the board. Very unpleasant move to deal with. And here Wojtaszek made a mistake. He played queen c6. Rook c5 is objectively probably the best move, but when the queen has so many options to come down here, I'm not surprised that Wojtaszek didn't entertain this idea. So, well, let me show you one potential pitfall for black. The queen comes down, so the queen, desperate to exchange again. queen b7, hitting the weak point here, rook c7, and now there's a lovely combination. Pawn takes pawn. If rook takes, then double check. King goes in the corner, and that is checkmate. Or in this situation, if black recaptures, then rook g6 is a winning move. Now that can't be taken with a pawn because of the pin. And if queen takes rook, white, by that little transaction, has won a pawn, and that will be enough to win because there's still weak pawns all over the place. Let's go back. So in this position, Wojtaszek, under extreme pressure on the position, but also his clock, he was running short of time. He played queen c6, and this was a miscalculation. Carlsen snaffled the pawn in the middle of the board. Now, the tactics just don't work for black here. For example, bishop d6. You'd think that that might be okay, but then comes pawn takes pawn here, and this runs into the same tactics as we saw before. If pawn takes, then there's a pin. Rook takes, and that obviously wins. That can't be taken because of the pin. And if bishop takes queen, pawn takes pawn, double discovered check. The king has to move out of the way. Then rook g8, and you get a new queen on the next turn. So things have really collapsed here for Wojtaszek. So rook e7, attacking the queen stepped back, and if queen e4, then you can play bishop takes pawn check. Of course that can't be taken because the queen would be taken there, so white wins a pawn, should be good enough to win. So a4 from the pole, bishop d5, attacking the queen. If queen takes pawn, I'm afraid this would just allow white's rook to enter the position, rook c8, and this is fatal. Queen h6 threatened. If pawn to d3, then rook f3, and there's no decent defense to white's attack here. So after bishop d5, the queen was attacked, came back. Wojtaszek desperate to exchange queens, but no. Carlsen was having none of it. Queen d2, excellent move. So just keeping tabs on this weak pawn now. Carlsen, I think, shows impressive restraint at this moment. He's a pawn up, he has a completely secure position, and he simply doesn't rush things. He has no need to. He makes sure everything's secure before he goes in for the kill. Exchanges on g6. Now this is a very nice touch. He just improves the position of his king. So his king is now completely secure on this light square. Notice this bishop is on a light square, all these pieces on light squares, so black cannot get a stray hit against the king. And now Carlsen can turn his attention to mopping up. The queen comes back to d1. So sometimes there'll be the idea of rook d3 hitting this pawn, sometimes queen a1 hitting the pawn here. Maybe that rook will swing across to here. Black is utterly lost, and actually Wojtaszek collapsed very quickly after rook f6. And now this nice move c3, opening up the queen's diagonal here, and after pawn takes, rook a4, and here Wojtaszek resigned. If queen takes pawn, then queen d4 check, and the king, that's the nicest move, threatening the bishop and threatening queen h4 mate. So the queen has to go backwards, but that's now 2 pawns for white, and that's too much. Wojtaszek had enough, understandably. Beautiful win by the world champion. I mean, really, he was in his element. And a very nice, tricky opening idea from him as well. So going into, after round 2, Elyanov leads with 2 out of 2, but Carlsen is just behind with 1.5, along with Pentala Hare Krishna.